The morning Charlotte Ralston buried her husband, the sky over Harlan Creek, Texas, turned the color of old pewter and refused to let a single ray of sunlight through, as if heaven itself was holding its breath in the presence of her grief. That was the spring of 1878, and by the time the summer heat cracked the earth around the small homestead she and Thomas had built with their own hands, Charlotte had come to understand a truth that no one at the funeral had been kind enough to tell her plainly. Grief, unlike the rain, does not soften the ground. It only makes the clay harder to work. She had 3 children. Daniel was 11, old enough to understand that his father was gone and young enough to still cry about it in the barn where he thought no one could hear him. Mee was 7, and she had her father's brown eyes and his stubborn way of setting her jaw when she didn't want to do something. Little Henry was barely 4, and he spent the first 2 weeks after the burial asking where Papa had gone to sleep and when he was coming back. Charlotte was 31 years old. She had strong hands and a back that had never once shied from hard work. She could mend a fence line, slaughter a hog, salt and smoke the meat herself, and still have biscuits on the table by sundown. Thomas had always said she was the most capable woman he had ever met, and she had laughed and told him he hadn't met enough women. Now she clung to that capability like a rope over a ravine. Thomas had died of a chest infection that came on quick and mean, the kind that turns a man to gray in the space of a fortnight. The doctor from Red Creek had ridden out twice, left a bottle of syrup and a look of quiet helplessness, and charged her $2 for the trouble. Thomas had died anyway, on a Wednesday afternoon in March, while the mockingbirds were arguing in the oak tree outside the bedroom window. The farm was not in good shape. Thomas had borrowed money the previous autumn to buy seed and repair the roof, and the debt sat on the land like a stone. There were also tools, a good iron post-hole digger, a large handsaw with a fresh-set blade, and a heavy splitting maul that Thomas had borrowed from the man on the property 3 miles east. Charlotte had meant to return them in the weeks after the burial, but the weeks had a way of filling themselves up with survival, and the tools had remained in the barn, leaning against the wall in a small and silent accusation. The man 3 miles east was named Isaac Reed. Charlotte knew him the way most people in that part of Harlan Creek knew their nearest neighbors, by sight, by reputation, and by occasional transaction. She knew he ran a clean, orderly operation on his 200 acres. She knew he'd come to Texas from Missouri 7 years back and had broken the land himself without a partner. She knew he was quiet at the church socials, spoke carefully when he spoke, and had once helped pull old Emmett Walsh's wagon from the creek without being asked or thanked. She did not know him well, and in the months after Thomas died, she did not have time to remedy that. What she had time for was the field, the children, the mending, the cooking, the animals, the repairs, and the slow, terrible arithmetic of trying to make a life work on the edge of what was barely possible. By the time August came baking down on Harlan Creek, Charlotte had managed to get the corn in, collect enough eggs to trade at the general store in town, and patch the section of fence along the south pasture that the late spring storm had taken apart. Daniel helped where he could, and Charlotte was proud of him in a way that broke her heart a little every time she watched him struggle with something that should have been a grown man's task. It was on a hot Thursday morning in early September when she noticed the tools again. She had gone to the barn to find the large iron file she used to keep the axe blade true, and she nearly tripped over the splitting maul where it leaned against the wall. She stood there for a moment, looking at the borrowed tools. Thomas's handwriting was not on them, but his hands had touched them, and that was almost the same thing, and she made a decision. She called Daniel in from where he was stacking wood along the side of the house. He came at a jog, red-faced and sweaty, with his dark hair plastered against his forehead. He was a good-looking boy, all angles and energy, with Thomas's square jaw and Charlotte's pale gray eyes. "I need you to take something over to Mr. Reed's place," she said. "Those tools your father borrowed, the post-hole digger and the saw and the maul, they've been sitting in that barn since March and it isn't right. Daniel looked at the tools, then at his mother. "That's a far walk. Take the mule. Bess won't want to go in this heat." "Bess doesn't get a vote," Charlotte said, and there was enough edge in her voice that Daniel didn't push further. She wrapped a cloth around the saw blade so it wouldn't cut through anything it wasn't meant to, and she helped Daniel load the tools into the old canvas sack they used for large hauling. She balanced them all across the front of the mule's pack so it wouldn't shift and throw Bess off her stride, and she made sure the post-hole digger was tied down clean. "You tell Mr. Reed we're sorry for the delay," she said. "Tell him they're returned in good condition and that I'm grateful." "Yes, ma'am." "And Daniel." She put a hand on his shoulder. "You mind your manners. Mr. Reed is a decent man, and we owe him a proper apology for keeping his property this long." "Yes, ma'am," Daniel said again, and then he was off, leading Bess by the rope at a slow, plodding walk down the trail that cut through the cedar scrub toward the eastern property. Charlotte stood and watched until they disappeared behind the tree line, and then she turned back to the house and the thousand things waiting for her inside it. She put water on to boil for the laundry. She checked on Henry, who had fallen asleep in the shade of the porch. She sent me to gather the eggs and reminded her to count them carefully and not to drop the basket again. She sat at the kitchen table for precisely 4 minutes, which was all the rest she allowed herself in any given morning, and she stared at the window and at the bright hard sky beyond it. She was not thinking about Isaac Reed. She was thinking about the debt payment due in October and whether the corn yield would be enough. That was what she was thinking. She was still at the table, working through numbers on the back of an old envelope, when she heard the sound of hooves on the dry earth outside. She assumed it was Daniel returning, and she didn't look up right away. She heard the familiar creak of the porch step, and then a knock at the door, which was odd because Daniel never knocked at his own front door. "Come in," she called. The door opened, and it was not Daniel. It was a man she recognized and did not know, tall, with a lean frame that carried itself with the particular quiet confidence of someone who worked hard land alone and had learned to trust only his own judgment. He had dark brown hair, sun-bronzed skin, and a jaw that was rough with 2 days of stubble. His eyes, when they settled on her across the room, were a steady, serious shade of green-brown that she had not noticed before because she had never had occasion to look at them this closely. Isaac Reed stood in the doorway of her kitchen and held his hat in both hands. "Mrs. Ralston," he said, "I apologize for coming without warning. Your boy came to my place with the tools just now, and he mentioned you were here alone with the children, and He stopped, looked down at his hat, started again. "I hope I'm not intruding." Charlotte had risen from the table out of reflex, the way a person does when they've been raised to stand for company. She smoothed the front of her apron and said, "You're not intruding, Mr. Reed. Please come in." He came in, and as he did, Daniel appeared behind him, tying Bess to the porch rail with a look of mild sheepishness on his face that Charlotte knew meant her eldest son had done something she had not told him to do. "Daniel," she said, keeping her voice level, "did you invite Mr. Reed to our home?" Daniel's chin came up in a way that was so precisely Thomas's gesture that it made her chest tighten. "I invited him to supper," he said. "Ma'am." There was a moment of perfect stillness in the kitchen. Charlotte looked at her son, then at Isaac Reed, who had the decency to look both sorry and amused at exactly the same time. "I told the boy I didn't want to impose," Isaac said, "but he was fairly persuasive." "He is that," Charlotte agreed. She took a breath. She thought about the fact that she had a pot of beans soaking and a side of salt pork and enough cornbread to feed 4 people if she stretched it, and that this man had let Thomas borrow his tools without complaint and had never once come to collect them. "You're welcome to stay for supper, Mr. Reed," she said, "if you can forgive the plainness of it." "I've eaten plain food my whole life," he said, and there was something in how he said it without apology or pretense that made her feel, for the first time in a long time, that she was talking to someone who meant exactly what they said. "Then sit down," she said. "I've got cornbread to make." She turned back to the counter and began measuring out the meal, and she told herself very firmly that the warmth she felt in her face was from the fire she was about to build under the stove, and nothing else whatsoever. Isaac Reed sat at the table with Daniel and me, who had come in from the yard with her basket of eggs, and had fixed the stranger with a long, evaluating stare. Henry had woken from his nap and wandered in, and he stood in the middle of the kitchen floor looking at the large, quiet man at the table with enormous, serious eyes. "You're big," Henry said. "Henry," Charlotte said from the stove. "It's all right," Isaac said. He looked at Henry with genuine gentleness. "I am on the tall side. Does that bother you?" Henry considered this with the gravity of a very small judge. "No," he decided, and went to sit on the floor near his sister. Isaac watched the children with an expression Charlotte caught in the reflection of the small window above the stove, something careful and warm, like a man who was not accustomed to having children nearby and found them both foreign and wonderful. "How long have you been on your place, Mr. Reed?" she asked, to make conversation, to fill the silence with something normal. 7 years come November," he said. "I came down from Missouri with 1 horse and a wagon of supplies and more optimism than sense." Daniel laughed, the honest laugh of a boy who didn't know yet to suppress such things. "Did you break all that land yourself?" Charlotte asked. "Most of it," Isaac said. "I hired hands for 2 seasons when I was getting the house up, but after that it was just me. I prefer working alone, or I did." He paused. "I've been reconsidering that lately." Charlotte did not ask what had prompted the reconsideration. She stirred the beans and sliced the salt pork and told herself she was not curious. She was extremely curious. Supper was ready as the last of the daylight turned the kitchen to amber, and they sat together, Charlotte, Isaac, and the 3 children, around the table that Thomas had built with his own hands from cedar planks the first winter they'd been on this land. It was a good table, solid and square, and it had fit 4 people perfectly for years. With 5 it felt like something different, not cramped, just full. Isaac ate slowly and with attention, the way a man does when he has been eating alone for too long and has forgotten that food is something you're supposed to enjoy. He complimented the cornbread twice, genuinely and without flattery, and he listened to Daniel explain the corn yield situation with the focused interest of a man who understood farming and respected the person explaining it. "You got the north field in this year?" Isaac asked Daniel. "Yes, sir, just barely. Ma broke the ground and I followed with the seed." "That's hard clay up there on the north side," Isaac said, glancing at Charlotte with something in his expression she couldn't quite name. "Breaking that alone would take it out of most men." "I'm not most men," Charlotte said, and it came out more bold than she'd intended. Isaac looked at her across the table. A small, quiet smile crossed his face and settled there. "No," he said. "I can see that." She looked away first, back to her plate, and she was annoyed at herself for the way that small exchange had made the air feel different in the room. After supper, the children were put to bed. Henry first, then me, then Daniel, who pushed back on bedtime with the persistence of someone who had appointed himself the man of the house and felt that entitled him to stay up with the adults. Charlotte was firm about it, and Daniel went, though he said goodnight to Isaac with a handshake that was so carefully formal and grown-up that Isaac returned it with equal seriousness, and Charlotte had to turn away so Daniel wouldn't see her expression. She came back to the kitchen to find Isaac standing near the door with his hat in his hands again. "I ought to be getting back," he said. "It's a good ride in the dark." "It is," she agreed. She stood a few feet from him and felt the strange, peculiar awareness of a person who has not stood this close to someone of consequence in a very long time. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Reed. I'm sorry my son put you in an awkward position." "He didn't," Isaac said. "I could have said no." He turned his hat a half-turn in his hands. "I didn't want to." She met his eyes, and there was a moment between them that was quieter and more serious than anything that had been said out loud all evening. "Well," she said finally, "you're welcome back then, if you find yourself on this end of the county." "I'll keep that in mind," he said. He stepped out onto the porch and down the steps, and she watched from the doorway as he mounted his horse, a deep roan gelding with a quiet, well-trained manner, and touched the brim of his hat toward her before turning the animal east. She stood in the doorway until the sound of hoofbeats faded into the dark. Then she went inside and sat at the table and pressed her hands flat on its surface and took 3 very slow, deliberate breaths. She was being foolish. She knew she was being foolish. A man had come to supper because her son had asked him, and had been polite and agreeable, and had eaten her beans and cornbread and said nothing inappropriate. This was not a situation requiring any kind of deep reflection. And yet, she picked up the envelope with the debt figures and stared at the numbers for a long time without seeing any of them. 2 weeks passed before she saw Isaac Reed again. She was at the general store in town when it happened, Harding's Mercantile on the main street of Harlan Creek, which was only barely a town, being more of an arrangement of buildings that had agreed to appear near each other. The store smelled of leather and dried beans, and the slightly sour edge of the barrel crackers by the door. Charlotte was pricing bolt cloth when she heard his voice behind her, talking to Ed Harding about a shipment of barbed wire he'd ordered that hadn't come in yet. She felt herself straighten before she turned around, which annoyed her significantly. When he saw her, something in his face shifted, not dramatically, not in any way she could have pointed to and described to someone later, but she felt it the way you feel a change in wind direction. A settling. "Mrs. Ralston," he said. "Mr. Reed." There was the particular awkwardness of two people who have had one meaningful conversation and are not yet sure if they are allowed to be glad to see each other. Charlotte managed it by asking him about the barbed wire, which was a practical question and therefore safe. He managed it by answering her seriously and then asking about her south fence, which she had mentioned at supper as a concern. They stood in Harding's Mercantile for 20 minutes talking about fencing, and then about the autumn harvest, and then, somehow, about Missouri, which Isaac described with the careful affection of someone who had loved a place and chosen to leave it anyway. "Why Texas?" she asked. "Missouri has good land." "It does," he said, "but it had a lot of other things too by 1871. Memories, old arguments. I wanted ground that didn't know my name yet." She understood that. She understood it in a way that reached below the surface of polite conversation and touched something she rarely let anyone near. "Thomas brought me out here from Ohio," she said. "I had never been west of Columbus. I thought Texas would look like a painting I'd seen once, all red canyons and dramatic formations." "Does it?" "It looks like hard work," she said, and he laughed, and the laugh was warm and unguarded and changed his whole face, and she stored that away somewhere in the back of her mind without quite meaning to. He helped her carry her parcels to the wagon. She had not asked him to and had been about to refuse, but he'd simply picked up the heavier sack of flour before she could object, and it seemed more trouble to make a point of it than to just let him. He loaded it into the wagon bed with the ease of someone for whom lifting was simply a part of living. "Those tools of yours were in fine condition," she said, because she had been meaning to say it and hadn't yet. "Thomas took good care of them." Something in Isaac's expression softened. "He was a careful man," he said. "I could tell from the way he farmed." It was a generous thing to say and sincerely meant, and Charlotte felt her throat tighten for a moment before she got control of it. "He was," she said. "He was very careful." Isaac nodded. He seemed to understand that the conversation had reached a tender edge and he didn't push past it. That restraint, she thought, was its own kind of consideration. They parted with a nod and the particular formality of two people who are being careful. Charlotte drove the wagon home under a wide blue sky and let herself think about very little for most of the ride. The following Saturday, he appeared at her fence line. She was out in the north field checking the corn when she saw him coming along the tree line on his roan, moving at an easy walk. He raised a hand when he saw her and she raised one back, and he rode to the fence and stopped there and got down from his horse. "I had some extra wire from my south pasture repair," he said, holding up a coil of barbed wire. "More than I needed. I thought you might be able to use it for that section by the creek you mentioned." She looked at the wire. She looked at him. She was not a woman who accepted charity easily. Thomas had always said that about her, and it was true, and she was proud of it. "I can't take that without paying you for it," she said. "Then pay me in labor," he said. "I've got a full day's work I can't get through alone this week. You lend me Daniel for an afternoon and we'll call it even. That was clever. She appreciated clever solutions that preserved everyone's dignity. Deal, she said. He spent 2 hours that afternoon helping her patch the fence along the creek bed. She worked beside him and they said little, but the silence between them was different from the silences she'd known since Thomas died. Those silences had been empty. This one had something in it, a kind of companionable weight, like two people who had mutually agreed that talking wasn't always necessary. His hands were capable and quick. He set the posts with the authority of someone who has done this 1,000 times and knows exactly how the earth receives a post correctly. When they were done, they sat on the creek bank for a few minutes. Charlotte had brought water in a tin canteen and she offered it to him first. He took it, drank, handed it back. "This is good land," he said, looking across her creek pasture. "It's stubborn land," she said. "Good land usually is." The creek ran low and clear over the limestone shelf below them, making a sound like distant conversation. A pair of herons stood motionless in the shallows downstream. The light was thick and gold with the late afternoon. "Can I ask you something, Mr. Reed?" She said, "You can ask me anything, Mrs. Ralston." "Do you ever find it," she searched for the right word, "do you find it lonesome, out on your place alone all these years?" He thought about it honestly. She could see him thinking about it, which she respected. "Yes," he said finally, "more so lately. I think a man can get accustomed to solitude to the point where he mistakes it for contentment, and then something comes along and shows him the difference." She did not ask what had shown him the difference. The light was doing something complicated on the surface of the creek, and she watched it. "I am lonely," she said, quietly and without self-pity, because it was simply true and she was a truthful person. "I have the children and the work, and most days that is enough. But in the evenings after they're in bed, there's a particular quality of quiet that I'm not." She stopped. "I'm not accustomed to it yet." "No," he said, "I don't imagine you are." He didn't fill the silence with false comfort or empty reassurance. He just sat with her in it for a moment, and that was better. When he left, she watched his horse carry him back through the cedar scrub, and she held the canteen in both hands and thought about what she had said, and what he had said, and what neither of them had said yet. October came with its blaze of light and its cooling nights, and Isaac Reed came with it. Not every day, and not intrusively. He had a sixth sense about the difference between helpful presence and unwelcome intrusion that Charlotte had never seen in a man before. He came when there was a practical reason, and he made sure there was always a practical reason. He brought the extra wire. He came to help Daniel with a fence post that had rotted at the base and needed pulling. He appeared one morning with a young boar piglet he'd acquired from the Halstead farm and didn't need, knowing she'd been hoping to expand her livestock before winter. Each time, he stayed longer than the errand required. Each time, Charlotte found herself less opposed to this arrangement than she suspected she should be. The children adapted to his presence with different speeds. Daniel had decided, apparently at the moment he issued that supper invitation, that Isaac Reed was exactly the kind of man worth knowing, and he stuck to his side with a devotion that might have embarrassed Charlotte if Isaac hadn't seemed to genuinely welcome it. Me watched him from a cautious distance for 3 weeks before she allowed him to help her with the stuck clasp on the chicken coop door, and from that point treated him with the measured tolerance she extended to things she had decided were acceptable. Henry simply loved him, fully and immediately, in the way small children love people who get down to their level and treat their questions like real questions. Charlotte watched all of this from the careful distance of a woman who was not yet willing to name what she was feeling. On a Tuesday in mid-October, she drove the corn to town. The yield had been better than the numbers had promised, and she was able to make the debt payment with enough left over for winter supplies and a small reserve. Ed Harding at the store congratulated her on her harvest and said she'd done well for herself this year, and she thanked him and paid for her flour and her lamp oil and her sugar with the quiet private satisfaction of a woman who has done hard things and survived them. She was walking out to the wagon when she passed 2 men outside the barber shop whose conversation stopped her in her tracks. She recognized one of them, Cyrus Holt, who had a spread up near the North Fork of Harlan Creek and a reputation for land greed that was not entirely unearned. He was talking to another man she didn't know, and she heard her own name clearly enough to stop moving. "Ralston widows behind on the eastern quarter boundary," Holt was saying. "Thomas filed the claim before he was married and the paperwork's got a dispute on it from '74. She probably doesn't even know." Charlotte stood very still. "Land office says there's a query on it," Holt continued, "and if she can't produce the original deed amendment, the disputed 40 acres along the creek reverts to county. Which means it goes up for purchase." "And you'd be buying," the other man said. "I'd be buying," Holt agreed, with the satisfaction of someone who has already done the arithmetic. Charlotte walked to the land office before she walked to the wagon. The land office was a narrow building next to the bank, kept by a man named Dunmore who smelled of pipe tobacco and wore his reading glasses on a cord around his neck. She sat across from him and asked him to pull the Ralston claim, and he did, and she read every word of it with the careful attention of a woman who had grown up in a household where reading mattered. Holt wasn't entirely wrong. There was a query on the 1874 amendment. But the amendment itself was filed correctly. She found the number, cross-referenced the original claim, and pointed to the recording date that Holt had clearly been hoping she wouldn't find. "This is filed and valid," she said to Dunmore. Dunmore looked at the document over his reading glasses with the expression of a man who has just been shown something he should have caught himself. "So it is," he admitted. "I'd like a certified copy," she said, "for my records." She walked out of the land office 20 minutes later with the certified copy under her arm, her hands steady, her jaw set in the way Mee had inherited from her father. She told Isaac about it that evening. He had come by to help Daniel patch a section of the barn roof before the cold set in, and afterward they sat on the porch steps while the children were inside, and she told him about Holt and the land office and what she had found. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, his expression was quiet and deliberate in a way she had come to recognize as his anger not hot, not dramatic, but deep and fixed. "Holt's been doing that up and down the county," he said. "Finding claims with any kind of irregularity and waiting for circumstances to put the owner in a weak position." "Well, my circumstances aren't weak enough," Charlotte said. "Not today." He looked at her with the full, serious attention he gave to things that mattered. "No," he said, "they aren't." There was a pause. The evening had turned cool and the first stars were appearing above the tree line. From inside the house she could hear me arguing with Daniel about something, the normal music of a household with children. "Charlotte," he said, and it was the first time he had used her first name. She turned to look at him. "I'm going to say something," he said carefully, "and I want you to know that you can tell me to mind my business and I'll respect that completely." "All right," she said. He turned his hat over once in his hands. It was a gesture she'd come to know something he did when he was working up to saying something that mattered. "I think about this place a great deal," he said. "I think about it," and he paused. "I think about you a great deal." The evening air sat between them, quiet and waiting. "I'm not a man who says things I don't mean," he continued. "And I know that you are a woman with every reason in the world to be careful. I know it's too soon. I know you've been through." He stopped, started again. "What I'm trying to say, with considerably less grace than I'd like, is that I am not going anywhere. And I'm not here out of obligation or out of pity, and I want to be very clear about that. I'm here because I want to be." Charlotte looked at the stars. They were multiplying rapidly now, the way they do in the Texas autumn, covering the sky until there's no room for darkness between them. "I know why you're here," she said finally. Her voice was level and steady, but inside she felt something shifting, like a door that had been closed a long time beginning to open. "I've known for a while." "And," he said. "And I'm afraid," she said honestly. "I would be a fool not to be." "But I'm not afraid of you, Isaac. I want you to know that." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "That's enough for now." And it genuinely was. The weeks that followed had the quality of something careful being built. There was no rushing, no dramatic declarations, no events that Charlotte would later have to classify as a mistake. Instead, there were conversations that went deeper each time they had them. There were evenings on the porch when the children were in bed, with coffee and the night sounds of the creek and the cedars, where they talked about Missouri and Ohio and the things they'd left behind and the things they'd brought with them. There were moments when Isaac helped with something on the farm and Charlotte noticed the particular efficiency of his movements and thought, with a clarity she could no longer pretend, was general observation, that she found it deeply satisfying to watch him work. He told her about his family in Missouri, a father who'd been a harsh man with land, but a fair one, something Isaac had spent years untangling to understand. A mother who had died when he was 15, and whom he still thought about every time he planted anything, because she had been the one to teach him how. A younger brother in Kansas City who wrote letters irregularly and owed Isaac $20 he had never asked to have back. She told him about growing up in Columbus, about her father's print shop, where she had learned to read type as a child and developed a lifelong love of the precision of words. About how Thomas Ralston had come into her father's shop to order a batch of business cards and had stayed 3 hours talking to her, which her father had initially objected to, and later told her was the best advertisement for literacy he'd ever seen. She told him about Thomas with the careful honesty of a woman who had loved her husband genuinely and was not going to pretend otherwise to make someone new feel better. Thomas had been a good man. He had been warm and funny and occasionally maddening, and he had loved her and their children with everything he had. She would not reduce him or diminish him. Isaac listened to all of it. "He sounds like someone worth missing," he said. "He was," she said. "He is." "I'm not asking you to stop missing him," Isaac said. "Good," she said, "because that would be a losing proposition." He smiled. That warm, unguarded smile that she thought about sometimes when she had no business thinking about anything except what she was actually doing. November arrived and brought a cold snap that killed the last of the garden and stripped the trees along the creek to their gray winter bones. Charlotte got the children properly set for school, which meant 3 days a week at the old Pryor homestead that had been converted to a schoolhouse 2 years back. Daniel had shot up another inch over the summer and was beginning to look disturbingly like someone who would be a man very soon. Me had learned to read well enough to be a menace at it, having taken to reading aloud at the table during meals in a way that was both impressive and occasionally maddening. Henry had started helping Charlotte collect the eggs in the morning with a solemn devotion that made her want to laugh and weep at the same time. They were good children. They were Thomas's children and hers, and they were going to be fine. She had known this since the spring, in the way you know something not because you've proven it but because you've decided it. The Sunday before Thanksgiving, Isaac came for supper. This time it was not a surprise. This time Charlotte had invited him, which was a different thing entirely, and she had made a proper roast chicken with the onions and the dried herbs from the summer garden, and she had baked an apple pie because the tree along the south fence had given a surprising amount of fruit, and the children had asked specifically for pie. He arrived at the door with his hat in one hand and a small bundle wrapped in brown paper in the other. "I didn't want to come empty-handed," he said, and handed her the bundle. Inside was a length of deep blue wool cloth, fine quality, the kind she would not have bought for herself. She looked up at him. "I thought you might make something warm for the winter," he said, without any awkwardness about it, just a direct and simple statement of what the gift was for. She looked at the cloth for a long moment. It was the color of deep water, of winter sky. It was beautiful in the way that practical, beautiful things are beautiful when someone who knows you has chosen them specifically. "Thank you, Isaac," she said, and meant it in a way that went past the cloth. He sat at the table with the children while she finished the cooking, and Daniel drew him into a conversation about horses that was apparently of mutual deep interest, and me read to him from the book she was currently working through. a natural history of North American birds that she had gotten from the school library and was deeply invested in. And Henry sat on his knee without asking permission and fell asleep there before the chicken was even carved. Charlotte looked at the scene from the stove, Isaac sitting at the cedar table Thomas had built, with Henry asleep against his arm and me reading herons to him, and Daniel explaining the finer points of quarter horse breeding as if he were a man of 40 rather than 11, and she felt something complete itself inside her. Not a replacement of what had been there before, not an erasure. Something new growing alongside the old grief, the way prairie grass grows back after a fire, different but real, and its own kind of life. After supper, after the children were in bed, they sat on the porch in the cold with their coffee. The night was clear and fierce with stars. The Milky Way ran overhead like a river of light, bright enough to read by if you had extraordinary eyes. "I should tell you something," Charlotte said. "Tell me," he said. She looked at the stars. "I've been thinking about what you said in October, about being here because you want to be." "I meant it," he said. "I know you did." She set her coffee cup on the porch rail and turned to look at him. His face in the starlight was quiet and serious, the way it always was when something mattered. "I've been thinking about what I want, what would be right for me and for the children, and—" She took a breath. "I'm not very good at the beginning of things. I am much better at the middle of things when everything is established and working. The beginning is I don't know how to do it gracefully." "Neither do I," he said, "but you said it anyway." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. A coyote called from somewhere far to the south, and the cedars answered with a small shiver in the wind. "I think about you," she said. "I have been thinking about you for some time. I think that perhaps I am—" She stopped, tried again. "I think I would like very much to see where this goes, if you're still of the same mind." He looked at her across the short, cold space between them on the porch, and the expression on his face was one she hadn't quite seen before, something open and certain and careful all at once, the expression of a man who has been hoping for something and has just been told he's allowed to have it. "I am very much still of the same mind," he said. She reached out and put her hand on his, where it rested on the porch railing. Just her hand on his in the dark, with the stars overhead. He turned his hand over and held hers, and that was how it started, not with dramatic pronouncements or sweeping gestures, but with two steady hands in the dark on a November porch in Texas. Winter settled in properly after that, the way Texas winters do, not the brutal locked-in cold of the northern states, but a long gray chill that got into the bones and stayed there, with occasional cold, hard rains and the rare thrilling shock of frost on the ground in the early mornings. Charlotte put up her winter stores and banked the fires and patched the draft in the kitchen wall that had been letting cold air in along the east corner. The children grew in the way children grow in winter, quietly, steadily, like roots. Isaac came twice a week now, sometimes more. He brought firewood he'd cut from the dead oaks along his property line, which was useful and not charity, and Charlotte could accept it as such. He helped Daniel with the heavier barn work. He brought his horse over one afternoon specifically so Henry could sit on it in the paddock, led it a walk by Isaac's patient, steady hand, while Henry held the saddle horn with the intense concentration of a boy who was trying very hard not to show how excited he was. Daniel asked him one evening, with the directness of a boy who has decided tact is for people who have more time, "Are you going to marry our mother?" Charlotte, who was standing right there, felt the earth tilt slightly. Isaac looked at Daniel with perfect composure. "That," he said, "is something I'd like to discuss with your mother privately if she's agreeable, but I'll tell you this, I have every intention of being honorable about it." Daniel absorbed this with great seriousness. "All right," he said, "that's fair," and he went back to eating his supper as if he had just concluded a satisfactory piece of business, which Charlotte supposed he had. Later, when the children were in bed, Charlotte came to the kitchen to find Isaac still at the table, his coffee gone cold, his hat turning slowly in his hands. "I'm sorry about Daniel," she said. "Don't be," he said. "He's protecting you, I respect it." She sat down across from him. The lamp threw a warm, unsteady light across the table between them. "Isaac," she said. "Charlotte," he said. "What?" Daniel asked. She folded her hands on the table and looked at them. "Is that something you've been considering?" "Since September," he said. She looked up. "September. The first supper," he said. "I know it's too soon. I know there is grief that doesn't go on a timetable. I know you're a woman who needs to make her own decisions and resents anyone who tries to make them for her." A corner of his mouth moved, "which I find, if I'm being honest, extremely admirable." "You haven't asked me yet," she observed. "No," he said, "I haven't." "Why not?" He looked at her steadily. "Because I wanted you to tell me you were ready to be asked, and you haven't told me that yet." This was, she thought, one of the most perceptive things anyone had ever said to her. She sat with it for a moment, testing it against what she knew of herself. "I think I'm close," she said. "Then I'll wait," he said simply. The thing about Isaac Reed she had discovered over these months was that he never said he would wait and then made the waiting difficult. He didn't create pressure and call it patience. He simply was patient, genuinely, in the way of a man who understood that good things required time and didn't try to rush the growing season. He came back the following Saturday and helped her go through the root cellar inventory for the winter, which was a practical and useful thing to do, and also, in the way of all practical things done together, intimately domestic. They counted jars and noted what she needed more of, and he told her he had extra salt-cured pork he'd put up that season that she was welcome to take, and she said she'd trade him for the pickled green beans she'd done up in August. And they stood in the dimness of the root cellar negotiating barter with the comfortable ease of two people who have been partners long enough to trust each other's accounting. When they came up out of the cellar into the winter daylight, she took his hand. He stopped walking. She kept hold of his hand and looked at him. "I'm ready to be asked," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, without any preamble or ornamentation, because that was simply how he was, "Charlotte Ralston, will you marry me?" "Yes," she said, "I will." He brought her hand up and pressed his lips to her knuckles with a formality that was both unexpected and somehow exactly right, and she felt the warmth of it travel up her arm and into her chest and settle there like a coal in a banked fire, steady and deep and lasting. They stood in the winter light of her farmyard and looked at each other with the clear-eyed satisfaction of two people who have arrived somewhere they were heading for a long time. "We'll need to tell the children," she said. "We will." "Daniel will be smug about it," she said. "He will be," Isaac agreed. "He's earned it." She laughed, a full, honest laugh that felt like something long held being released, and he looked at her with that warm, unguarded expression that was becoming her favorite sight in the world. They told the children that evening, all three of them together at the kitchen table. Daniel absorbed the news with the magnificent self-satisfaction of a person who considers himself responsible for the whole business, which Charlotte supposed, if she was being fair, was not entirely inaccurate. Me asked a series of practical and searching questions that included whether Isaac's horse would be kept in their barn, and whether the chickens would need to be moved, and whether she could have a different bedroom, which Isaac answered with the same careful respect he gave all of Me's inquiries. Henry looked at his mother and then at Isaac and then back at his mother and said, "So he's staying?" And when Charlotte said yes, he nodded once with the profound satisfaction of a small person who has known this was the right arrangement for some time. They married on the first Saturday of February, 1879, at the Harlan Creek Church, which was a small whitewashed building that smelled of pine wood and candle wax and the particular cold sweetness of a winter morning. Reverend Alcott performed the ceremony. It was not elaborate. Charlotte wore her good dress with a length of the deep blue wool made into a new collar, and Isaac wore his best suit, which he had clearly cleaned and pressed with great care, and the children sat in the front pew in their good clothes with their hair combed, Daniel upright and formal, Me watchful and precise, Henry bouncing his feet because he couldn't yet make them reach the floor. The neighbors who came filled half the church. Ed Harding from the store. Old Emmett Walsh from down the valley, who had once had Isaac pull his wagon from the creek. The Alcott family, Several others Charlotte knew from the years on the farm. They were not a social gathering of convenience. They were the people who had watched her navigate the previous year and who were genuinely glad to see her arrive at this moment. When Reverend Alcott asked if anyone present had objection to speak, there was a brief, charged silence, and Charlotte noticed Cyrus Holt standing in the back of the church, which she had not expected. He met her eyes with the flat expression of a man who has done his arithmetic and found himself on the losing side of it, and then he looked away. Isaac said his vows in the level, certain voice of a man who does not say things he doesn't mean, and Charlotte said hers with the clear-eyed directness of a woman who never has. When the Reverend said he could kiss his bride, Isaac cupped her face in his large, calloused hands with the extraordinary care of someone holding something precious, and he kissed her gently and with complete attention, and Henry said, "There it is," from the front pew in a tone of profound relief, and the whole church laughed. They moved Isaac into the farmhouse by the end of the week, not without some logistical complexity, as his household had 7 years of accumulated bachelor's habits to contend with, but Charlotte was efficient and Isaac was adaptable, and between them they managed it. His books filled the second shelf of the sitting-room bookcase. His tools joined hers in the barn, organized and labeled in a way that struck Charlotte as extremely satisfying. His roan gelding, whose name she now learned was Bishop, settled into comfortable cohabitation with their mule Bess and the 2 other horses they kept. The farm breathed differently with 2 people running it. Charlotte had not fully understood how much energy she had been expending simply to keep everything from getting worse, until she found herself, for the first time in almost a year, actually moving things forward. The fence line that had been a constant anxiety got properly repaired, not just patched. The north field got turned and manured for the spring planting. The section of the barn roof that had been worrying her since autumn got replaced entirely. And in the evenings, there was the extraordinary, ordinary luxury of not being alone, of having someone to eat supper with who was interested in what she had to say, and to sit with on the porch afterward, and to talk to about small things and large things alike, of waking in the morning to the sound of him building the fire in the kitchen, so that by the time she came downstairs, the cold had been pushed back and the coffee was already on. She had not known how much she'd missed that particular kind of warmth, not dramatic, not theatrical, but constant and reliable as a good fire. She had thought she was managing without it. She had not been managing, she had been surviving. This was different. Spring came early to Harlan Creek that year, pushing green up through the brown within the first week of March as if the land was in a hurry. Charlotte and Isaac planted the north field with corn again, and the south patch with sorghum, and a new kitchen garden that Isaac designed with a care for sun exposure and drainage that she found impressive and slightly competitive, which she told him, and which he accepted as the compliment it was intended to be. Daniel, with the accelerated awareness of a boy who now had an adult man working beside him who treated him as something approaching an equal, was growing up faster than Charlotte liked, and at exactly the right pace. Isaac worked with him seriously and patiently, explained his reasoning rather than just issuing instructions, and had a gift for pitching tasks at the exact level where Daniel could succeed with effort, which was the right kind of lesson. By May, Daniel could shoe a horse and mend a harness and explain the reasoning behind a crop rotation. He carried himself differently. Charlotte watched this with a complicated pride. Me, having completed her 3-week evaluation of the new domestic arrangement, had concluded that it was acceptable and had begun to warm in the particular measured way she had inherited from her father slowly, and then completely. She asked Isaac to read to her sometimes in the evenings, and he did, with the same careful attention he brought to everything, and she corrected his pronunciation twice, and he thanked her both times, which won him her respect permanently. On a warm evening in April, Charlotte sat on the porch after the children were in bed and Isaac came out and sat beside her, and they looked at the dark spring sky together. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Tell me," he said, in the steady, easy way he always said it. She turned to look at him. In the lamplight from the window, his face was warm and familiar in hers. "I'm expecting," she said. He was very still for a moment. Then he turned to her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, a kind of unguarded, full-faced joy that swept away all the careful steadiness and left something younger and more open underneath. "Charlotte," he said. "October, I think," she said. "I'm sure enough now to say it." He took her hands in both of his, and he held them, and he looked at her with the full weight of what this meant between them, and he said, "I am so—" He stopped. His voice had done something unexpected. He tried again. "I am very glad." "So am I," she said. He pulled her close, and she leaned against him in the warm April night, and the creek made its sound in the distance, and the stars multiplied overhead, and the new kitchen garden lay in its ordered rows along the south wall of the house, and everything was growing. The summer of 1879 was a good one. The corn came in strong. The sorghum did well. The kitchen garden produced so abundantly that Charlotte was putting up jar after jar in the root cellar, and still trading surplus at Harding's store for a profit that she noted with private satisfaction. Isaac had started growing a small orchard along the east boundary, apples and pear trees, newly planted, that would take years to produce, but represented a kind of faith in the future that she found deeply moving. She told him so one afternoon in July, when she brought him water out to where he was staking the young trees. "Planting trees you won't eat from for years," she said. "The children will eat from them," he said. "That's a patient way of thinking." "I plan to be here a long time," he said simply, and he said it with the same undemonstrative certainty with which he said everything that mattered, and she stood in the summer heat between the young trees and felt the kind of happiness that is not loud or dramatic, but is instead as deep and sustaining as groundwater. In August, Cyrus Holt sold his spread on the North Fork and left Harlan Creek. The news came through Ed Harding at the store, and it came with the information that Holt had tried to file one more boundary dispute against the Alcott family's property on his way out, and had been denied by the land office on grounds of insufficient evidence. Charlotte heard this news and allowed herself exactly one moment of quiet satisfaction before she got on with the rest of her day. Isaac's brother in Kansas City, whose name was Edward, wrote a letter in September congratulating them on the marriage in the warm but belatedly manner of a man who had gotten the news some months after it happened. He expressed a desire to visit when he could manage it, and said he was very glad Isaac had found someone sensible, which Charlotte read aloud to Isaac at the supper table, and which made Daniel laugh. Henry, in September, who had just turned 5, announced that he intended to be a farmer when he grew up. Charlotte asked him why. He said it was because you got to be outside all the time and also drive the mule. Isaac told him those were both sound reasons. The baby came on the 14th of October, 1879, on a clear, crisp morning when the cedar trees had gone a shade darker in the cool, and the mockingbirds were moving through the yard in their autumn migration. Charlotte's labor was managed by old Mrs. Ferris from town, who had delivered half the children in the county, and had strong, capable hands, and the calm authority of someone who has seen everything and panics about none of it. Isaac spent the labor hours alternating between the porch, where he was entirely useless but present, and the kitchen, where he made coffee that he didn't drink and paced in a way that Daniel watched with the sympathetic understanding of a boy who understood helplessness. When Mrs. Ferris opened the bedroom door and said, "Mr. Reed, you've got a son," Isaac went very still, and then he was through that door before she'd finished the sentence. Charlotte lay against the pillow, tired and luminous the way women are after birth, that particular exhausted brightness that comes from having done the most fundamental and demanding thing a human body does. She held the baby, who was red-faced and indignant and already attempting to convey displeasure with his situation through volume. Isaac sat on the edge of the bed beside her and looked at the baby with the expression he got when things mattered too much for his usual steadiness to fully contain. "He's fine," Charlotte said. "Mrs. Ferris says he's fine." "He's very loud," Isaac said. "He is that," Charlotte agreed. Isaac reached out and put one finger against the baby's hand, and the baby, with the reflexive grip of the newborn, seized it and held on with surprising force. Something crossed Isaac's face that Charlotte had no adequate words for, something complete and broken open and remade. "Thomas," she said, "if that's all right with you, his middle name." Isaac looked at her. His eyes were bright in a way she had not seen before. "Thomas," he said. "Yes, that's right." They named him William Thomas Reed. Will from the start because Henry couldn't get the full name out fast enough, and Will suited him besides. Henry was immediately devoted to Will in the manner of a child who has found his purpose. He sat beside the baby's cradle at every available opportunity, and reported on Will's activities to anyone who would listen with the seriousness of a field correspondent. Me held the baby with precise, careful arms and expressed cautious approval of his facial features. Daniel looked at the baby for a long time and then looked at Isaac and said, "He looks like you," and Isaac said, "He looks like himself," and Charlotte thought, watching them, that this was exactly the right answer. Will grew with the spring. He was a solid, cheerful baby who slept well and ate enthusiastically and greeted the world with an interest that suggested he intended to pay close attention to it. He was dark-haired like Charlotte, with eyes that settled into a steady hazel that was entirely his own. He laughed early and often, which Henry considered a personal achievement. The farm in the spring of 1880 was a different place from the farm Charlotte had been fighting to hold 18 months before. It was not that everything was easy. Nothing about farming in central Texas was ever easy, and there were always fences and droughts and livestock troubles, and the constant arithmetic of enough and not quite enough. But it was productive and forward-moving and inhabited by people who were working together, which made the hard parts different. Not lighter exactly, but shared, which was its own kind of relief. Isaac applied for formal joint deed on the property that spring, combining his 200 eastern acres with Charlotte's homestead in a single recorded claim. She had the land office draw up the papers and sign them with the careful hand she'd learned in her father's print shop, and Isaac signed beside her, and the combined property became the Reed Farm at Harlan Creek, 480 acres of cedar and limestone and creek pasture, and stubborn clay and good black soil along the bottoms, and it was theirs. Edward Reed made it down from Kansas City in June, a cheerful, somewhat disheveled man of 30 who had Isaac's green-brown eyes and a great deal more personal energy than his brother, and who was immediately and loudly delighted by everything he encountered, from the farm to the children to Charlotte, who he told Isaac he didn't deserve, which Isaac agreed with so readily that Charlotte laughed for a full minute. Edward stayed a week, ate everything put in front of him with great appreciation, and left with the $20 Isaac still hadn't asked for in a fine demonstration of the difference between the two brothers. Me started school at the proper schoolhouse that had opened in town that fall, a real one-room schoolhouse with a teacher who had come from Austin and had opinions about education that me found deeply compatible with her own. Me's intellectual ferocity, once properly aimed, was a force Charlotte both admired and found occasionally terrifying. The teacher, a young woman named Abigail Norris, wrote Charlotte a letter in October to say that Me was the most promising student she'd taught in 3 years, which Charlotte read to Isaac that evening with a pride she made no attempt to conceal. Daniel, at 13, was becoming someone. It was impossible not to notice. He had Thomas's jaw and Charlotte's eyes and a growing composure that was at least partly Isaac's influence, and he carried himself with a quiet self-possession that made the older men in town take him seriously in a way they didn't always take boys his age. He had decided, with the same decisive certainty with which he'd invited Isaac to supper, that he was going to be a rancher. Not a farmer, a rancher, with horses and cattle and proper open range. Isaac took this declaration seriously and began teaching him accordingly. There was an afternoon in September of 1880 when Charlotte found herself standing at the edge of the newly planted orchard. The young apple trees were shoulder-high now, promising but still years from fruit, and looking at her farm and everything on it. The house with its new south porch that Isaac had added in the spring. The barn with its sound roof and its organized interior. The kitchen garden in its late-season exhaustion. Bishop and Bess in the paddock. Henry chasing something across the yard with concentrated purpose. Will in his cradle on the new porch, asleep in the afternoon sun. Isaac somewhere she couldn't see him, probably at the creek fence, working on the section near the water where the bank had shifted in the summer rains. She stood in the young orchard and felt the particular wholeness of a life that had been broken and then remade into something that was not the same shape as before but was good. Different good. Not less than what came before and not more, just its own thing, fully itself. She had loved Thomas. She would always have loved Thomas. His absence was a real and permanent thing, like a room in the house that was not used anymore but was still there. She did not pretend it was otherwise, and she did not believe she was required to. And she loved Isaac. That had become fully clear to her somewhere in the winter just past, in a moment of such ordinary, everyday domesticity that she had almost missed it. He had been at the kitchen table reading, and she had brought him coffee without asking if he wanted it because she already knew he did, and he had looked up and said thank you with the full attention he gave to everything, and she had thought, there it is. That's what this is. Not the dramatic fall of early romance, but something broader and quieter and more like weather, pervading, constant, something you live inside of without always noticing it until you try to imagine it not being there. She heard his boots on the dry earth before she saw him, coming through the cedar scrub from the direction of the creek with the easy, unhurried stride of a man who belongs where he's walking. He saw her standing among the young trees and came to her without breaking stride, and when he reached her he stood beside her and looked at the same view she was looking at. "How's the fence?" she asked. "Solid," he said. "Another season and it'll need the post nearest the water replaced, but we've got time." She nodded. She put her hand in his, the way she'd started doing simply because she wanted to and had stopped needing a reason for it. "I was thinking about the trees," she said. "What about them?" "Will's going to be picking apples from them when he's 10, she said. "Maybe 11. He's going to climb this one." She pointed to the most vigorous of the young trees, the one that already had the promising shape of a good climber, "and he's going to fall out of it and scare us both to death and be absolutely fine." Isaac looked at the tree and then at her with the small, warm smile she loved. "You're probably right," he said. "I usually am," she said. "You usually are," he agreed. He pulled her hand up and pressed his lips to her knuckles, the same gesture as the day she'd said yes, and she felt it the same way traveling up from her hand into her chest and settling there, steady as a coal. They stood in the young orchard while Will slept on the porch and Henry pursued whatever he was pursuing across the yard, and the cedars held their dark green against the September sky. By the following spring, Charlotte knew she was expecting again. She told Isaac over breakfast, matter-of-factly, the way she tended to tell him things that mattered simply and directly, without preamble. He set down his coffee cup and looked at her with that open, unguarded joy that she now knew was his face's most honest expression. "When?" he asked. "November," she said. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "Good," he said. That was all, but the word contained everything it needed to. The second baby was a girl, born on a clear, cold evening in November 1881. She came into the world with considerably more composure than Will had, arriving quietly and looking around the room with enormous dark eyes as if she'd agreed to be born, but wasn't going to make a fuss about it. They named her Clara June Reed. Me was immediately and completely enchanted by her, which Charlotte had expected. Me had strong opinions about most things, and they were always fully committed. Daniel looked at the baby with the composed satisfaction of an eldest brother who has seen this procedure before and knows how it works. Will, now a year old, studied Clara with the puzzled expression of someone encountering a competitor they had not budgeted for, and then, after careful consideration, decided she was acceptable. Henry, aged 6, told his mother that Clara looked like a potato, which was not wrong and which Charlotte chose not to address directly. The farm went on. The seasons came and went in the way of Texas seasons: the burning August, the brief blaze of autumn, the gray winter cold, the sudden urgent spring. The children grew with the predictable relentlessness of the young. Daniel turned 14 and 15 and 16, and his ambitions about ranching grew more specific and his knowledge grew accordingly. And Isaac invested in his education with the serious attention of a man who understands that what you teach a young person is what they carry forward into the world. They acquired a small herd of longhorn cattle together in the spring of 1882, and Daniel's responsibilities with the herd gave him the kind of legitimate purpose that made him steady in a way Charlotte was profoundly grateful for. Me won a distinction at school that the Austin Education Board sent a letter about, which Charlotte framed and put on the wall, and me affected not to care about this and was obviously pleased. She had decided, at age 11, that she intended to be a school teacher, and had begun practicing on Will and Clara with an earnestness that was both educational and slightly alarming for the recipients. Henry remained himself cheerful, devoted to the farm and the animals, constitutionally incapable of staying clean for more than 40 minutes at any given time, and deeply attached to Will, whom he was teaching to identify every bird that came through the yard with an accuracy that delighted Isaac and surprised Charlotte. Henry had inherited his grandfather's love of the practical, and he moved through the farm with the comfortable authority of someone who knows where everything is and how it works and why. Will talked early and constantly, which no one had expected but all had in retrospect seen coming. He had opinions about most things and expressed them with a sociability that was entirely his own. By the time he was 2, he had learned to ask for things politely and to negotiate with Henry for preferred bird-watching positions along the fence, which Henry allowed with the patient good nature of an older sibling who knows he's been outmaneuvered but can't quite identify how. Clara grew into her dark eyes and developed, by the time she was walking and talking, a personality of such perfectly calibrated self-possession that Charlotte recognized it immediately as her own. She did not make demands. She simply decided what she wanted and moved toward it with a directness that was efficient and occasionally startling. On a January evening in 1883, when the children were variously in bed or getting there, and the house was settling into its night sounds around them, Charlotte and Isaac sat by the kitchen stove with the last of the coffee and the particular ease of 2 people who have shared enough evenings to have gotten all the awkward parts behind them. "I've been thinking," Isaac said, in the way he always prefaced the things he'd been thinking about for some time before he said them. "Tell me," she said. "Daniel wants to buy the Harris parcel when it comes up for sale in the spring," he said. "The 40 acres north of the creek. He's got enough saved from the cattle work for the down payment if we co-sign the note." Charlotte considered this. Daniel at 15 had the judgment of someone older and the Harris parcel was good land. She'd always thought so. "What do you think?" she asked. "I think he should do it," Isaac said. "I think he's ready. And I think it's important for him to have something that's his." She looked at him across the stove's warmth. "You've been thinking about this for a while." "Since October," he said. "You should have said so." "I was making sure I was right first," he said. She shook her head, but she was smiling. "You and your thinking," she said. "You married me knowing how I was," he said. "I did," she said. "It turned out to be a good decision." He looked at her across the kitchen in the January lamplight with an expression she recognized as the one he wore when he wanted to say something particular and was deciding how to say it. She waited, the way she'd learned to wait for him without impatience, knowing it would come. "I want you to know something," he said, "in case I don't say it often enough." "What?" He looked at the stove for a moment and then at her. "You saved this farm," he said. "Before I ever came into the picture. You took what Thomas built and you held it together through a year that would have broken most people, and you gave those children a life that was hard and real and good. I came in when the hard part was already done. She felt the warmth of it and the slight argument she had with it simultaneously. You came in when it needed a partner, she said. Maybe, he said, but I want you to know I see it. What you did, I've always seen it. She was quiet for a moment. The stove ticked. Outside, the January wind moved through the cedars. Thomas would have liked you, she said. I've thought about that. He was a good judge of men and he would have liked you very much. Isaac nodded, and the acknowledgment of that was between them, held with the careful respect it deserved. And I, Charlotte continued, like you very much myself, in case I don't say it often enough. He crossed the kitchen and sat beside her, and she leaned her head against his shoulder. And they finished their coffee in the January quiet, with the fire keeping the cold at bay, and their children asleep above their heads, and everything properly in its place. Daniel bought the Harris parcel in April, with their co-signature and the earnest money he'd saved, and a handshake at the land office that he conducted with such seriousness that the land agent afterward told Isaac he'd done a fine job raising that boy. Isaac said the boy had raised himself, largely, which was more generous than accurate but contained enough truth to stand. That summer, Charlotte planted a kitchen garden whose scope had expanded well beyond the original design to encompass a full quarter-acre of vegetables, herbs, and cutting flowers. The cutting flowers were a luxury that she did not apologize for. They were peonies and larkspur and sweet William and bachelor's buttons, and they were extraordinarily beautiful, and she brought them inside and put them in the tall blue ceramic jar that had been her mother's, shipped from Ohio the first year they'd been in Texas, and she arranged them on the kitchen table where everyone could see them. Isaac never commented on the flowers except to say they were fine, which was exactly the right thing to say. Clara, at 2, discovered an absolute devotion to the flowers that required careful management, as she had a tendency to conduct field research involving the pulling and redistribution of petals. Henry, at 8, had developed such an extensive knowledge of local birds that Reverend Alcott's wife had asked if he would come to talk to the women's reading circle about it, which Henry had done with an unexpectedly confident precision that left Charlotte feeling she had underestimated the nature of his particular competence. Will, at 3, had attached himself to the cattle operation with an interest that both surprised and delighted Daniel, who began teaching him the names of every animal in the herd with a patience that Charlotte had not known Daniel possessed and was glad to discover. In September of 1883, a letter arrived from the land office in Austin regarding a small grant being made available to homesteaders who had maintained and improved their claims for 15 years or more. The Reed Farm, combining the original Ralston claim from 1868 and Isaac's eastern parcel from 1872, qualified on combined grounds. They applied and were approved for an additional 12 acres along the south boundary, which Isaac said they would plant to pecan trees, and Charlotte said those would take 20 years to produce, and Isaac said that was fine because Will would eat the pecans, and Charlotte stood in the kitchen and loved him very completely. By the spring of 1884, the Reed Farm at Harlan Creek was a thing that worked. Not perfectly, and not without continued effort. Nothing in farming is ever fully achieved. It is always a work in progress, which Charlotte had come to understand was the point rather than the limitation. But it was sound and living and forward-facing. The cattle herd had grown. The orchard was producing its first real fruit. The apples were small but genuine, and Will ate 3 of them before Charlotte could catch him, and neither of them told Isaac. The pecan saplings were in the ground along the south boundary. Daniel's 40 acres were under good management. Mee was preparing to go to the normal school in Austin in the fall to complete her teaching certification, which she had decided on with the calm certainty of someone who has known what they intend to do for some time and is simply now getting around to it. Charlotte sat on the south porch one evening in April, which was her favorite kind of evening in Texas. The sun gone, but its warmth still in the stones of the porch, the cedar smell released by the cooling, the creek audible in the distance, the first stars beginning. Will was asleep. Clara was asleep. Daniel was in his cabin on the Harris parcel, where he had moved in the fall and was making his own life with the same methodical determination he'd always had. Henry was somewhere on the property observing something with his notebook, and a concentration that could not be interrupted by anything short of supper. Isaac came out and sat beside her with his coffee, the way he always did. She looked at the stars coming on above the cedar line and thought about the woman she'd been in 1878, standing in the pewter gray morning of Thomas's burial, holding herself upright through sheer, well, because the alternative was not available to her with 3 children watching. That woman had been strong and capable and entirely alone, and she had not imagined in the ragged grief of that spring that this was where she would arrive. She thought about Thomas with the measured tenderness that had replaced the sharp grief over time. She thought about his hands and his laugh and the way he'd stayed 3 hours in her father's print shop talking to a girl he'd just met. She thought about him with love and without the sorrow that used to accompany it, which was its own kind of healing. She thought about Daniel, who had shown up at Isaac Reed's door with a pack of borrowed tools and an 11-year-old's clear-eyed assessment of what his family needed, and had simply acted on it. That supper, that one evening, the whole architecture of her current life traced back to one boy's decisive and slightly unauthorized hospitality. "What are you thinking about?" Isaac said. "Daniel," she said, "inviting you to supper." He made the sound that was almost a laugh. That boy knew what he was doing. "He absolutely did," she said. "He always does." "Takes after his mother," Isaac said. She took his hand. They sat in the April evening with the stars multiplying above them and the farm around them in its spring readiness, ready to grow, ready to produce, oriented toward the future with the particular optimism of tended land, and the children quiet in their various places, and everything in its right order. The creek ran somewhere in the dark, making its quiet conversation with the limestone shelf. The young pecan trees stood in their new rows along the south boundary, patient and slow, and full of a future they didn't know about yet but were already working toward. Charlotte held her husband's hand in the spring night and felt, for the first time in a long time, something she recognized as peace, not the peace of things being finished, but the peace of things being properly, deeply, continuously in progress. The peace of a life that was working and growing and was hers. It was, she thought, exactly enough. It was, she thought, more than enough. It was everything. And somewhere in the north pasture, Henry Ralston was crouched in the dark beside a fence post with his notebook open, recording the call of a whippoorwill with the intense devotion of someone who understands that every living thing deserves to be properly seen. And Clara Reed was asleep in her cot with her dark eyes closed, and her whole enormous future waiting quietly in front of her, growing toward it already in her sleep. And Will Reed was asleep with his father's dark hair on the pillow and his grandmother's pale eyes, and the name of every longhorn in the herd catalogued neatly in his 3-year-old mind. And Mee Ralston was at her desk with her lamp burning, annotating a teaching primer with the focused precision of a woman who has decided what she will do with her life and is proceeding. And Daniel Ralston was in his cabin on his own 40 acres, looking out his window at the dark spring sky over the land that was his, planning tomorrow in the patient, practical way of a good farmer. And Charlotte Ralston Reed sat on the porch of the farm she had held and rebuilt and made into something new, holding the hand of the man who had walked through her kitchen door on an ordinary September evening, because her eldest son had asked him to supper, and he had not wanted to say no, and the world was good, and the stars were out, and the cedar trees held their dark green, and the creek ran on, and it was enough, and it was everything, and it was the full, real, irreplaceable shape of a life well lived and well loved.